Blind ones who speak so. Do you think they're real?
You must be going off. Give my regards to your man Arrhenius when you see him. Long ago, there was Shalanon, king of Ananur. When his sons Lokos and Silica traveled north to find the cause of their father's illness, they witnessed great and terrible things. It was beneath the mountain Lasheol that Silica perished, and Lokos beheld in the sky a wondrous message. When he returned to the south, he overthrew his father, and he took the name of the mountain as his own. It was there, in the ruins of Ananur, that Lasheol assumed the mantle of the first Lashatha. Gifted the world, he led his people north and raised the great city of Athurian. Marissa Savanis lived in Altazan, a city in southern Uthalor. It lay by the border of the will of Lashaol, the swiftly growing domain of Lashazul, he who deemed himself above all earthly things as a descendant of Lokos. She joined the Sarthoris family when she wed Daedran, an esteemed commander of the Shalashar, the shining host of the Will. Her father was Shardanos, one of the 7 rulers of Altazan's Theashar, those hallowed few that devoted their lives to seeking knowledge of Shaldokos, the realm above. With Daedran at her side, Marissa bore her only son, and she named him Yaran. In joy she watched as he grew in Altazan, for she loved him, and she deemed that all was right in the West. Yaran was still young when his father heard the call of the East. Baltaros, lord of Ulthandros, had become cruel and uncaring. Like many, he feared the Will, but in truth he admired its power and the majesty of its ruler. In his depravity, he began to treat with the West and formed closest ties with Altazan. Promised power, many fell under the sway of the Lord, and discontent grew in Ulthandros. Baltaros was subtle, and reasoned that he was saving his people, ensuring survival when the Will came to claim his home. But guilt dwelt deep within him, for the long friendship of Ancelion, king of Theandor, was ever on his mind. When word from Ulthandros ceased, Ancelion dispatched a number of his warriors, the Zeraphor, into the city. There, they began to restore order, and Baltaros, long removed to his chambers, became dismayed. In time, Ancelion judged that Baltaros must be dethroned. When he learned of this, watching from on high, a sea of Zeraphor marching upon his city, he succumbed at last to his desires. In wrath, he gathered his men, and the Black House of Baltaros readied for war. It was then that Baltaros called upon Altazan. Led by Asaras, son of Ancelion, the Zeraphor breached the city gates. Inside the walls they strove with the Black House and slowly gained ground. Then, at the command of the Lord, the western gate was opened, and the Shalashar fell upon them. In this betrayal, Baltaros had doomed his former allies, and as the battle raged, the Zeraphor looked ever more to the east for retreat. If not for the arrival of the Dekaru, ancient allies of Ulthandros, who charged fiercely into the side of the Shalashar, the Zeraphor would have fallen utterly. The Shalashar sustained heavy losses, but they were many, and with the aid of the Black House, they overcame their enemy. It was but a remnant of the Zeraphor that retreated into the east, and Ulthandros was claimed by the Will. For his treachery, Baltaros would not be slain, falling as the last lord of Ulthandros, but rise with the city as lord of Altheon. Asaras, son of Ancelion, died that day. Drakar, a loyal and dedicated Zeraphor, felt responsible for Asaras' death. Shame overwhelmed him, and he began to contemplate how he might rid himself of his guilt. It was but a few years later, when Ulthandros took on a new form and was renamed Altheon, that Marissa, Yaran, and Daedran traveled east with Shardanos. There, he would become the first High Theashar of the newly claimed city, the Eye of Altheon. Baltaros ruled with a heavy hand and was well respected, for he was relentless in all that he did. As Ulthandros faded, he proved to all that none of his past remained, and he became known as the Unyielding. No doubt was left in his mind that the peoples of the Will were the rightful rulers of the earth, and his hatred for his former allies grew daily. When they fell, he was there in an attempt to turn them, and if they denied him, he took pleasure in their suffering. None questioned that the Lord was truly one of Lashael's folk, and Lashazul looked upon him with favor. During Yaran's adolescence, Marissa grew troubled, for she was aware that her father's zealotry had increased tenfold when he came to the rising city. While she remained a Theashar, being proud of her heritage and dissenting to few of the Will's doctrine, her practice was diminished, and she began a long contemplation. With the fall of Ulthandros, the Masters of the West sought their next conquest. Theandul was near, but even Athurian feared the city of Ancelion, for it was regarded by the enemies of the Will as the capital of Uthalor, the last bastion. It was old and strong, and had still the aid of the Solvara in the distant east, the Dekaru in the north, and it was rumored that the lonely city had the hearts and minds of many peoples far beyond the West's reckoning. The Dekaru dwelt in Urtharu, a vast forest realm that covered much of central Uthalor. It was this ancient clan that came to the aid of Ulthandros, and threatened the defeat of the Shalashar. Baltaros commanded the burning of the forest, for his hatred for the people of the trees was unmatched. Daedran led his men against the Silandur, fierce bowmen who attacked from the shadows and delivered death unseen. This began the first incursion into the north, and marked the second time that Rakar Alonius of Theandul strove against the forces of Daedran, for Ancelion sent what little he could to the aid of his allies. In time, much of southern Urtharu was brought to ash, and the Dekaru fell away, shrinking back to their hidden homes. Victorious, Daedran was commanded to scout the far reaches of the land, and striding across hill and valley, he came into the arcane forest of Aberathon. The Solthari was an herb abundant by the coast of Altheon. When Baltaros ruled Ulthandros, he cared little for it, but Xanados, the Lord's son, knew it well. The Theashar requested that it be harvested when they learned that the plant was able to induce visions if prepared correctly. Shardanos was captivated by the effects of the Solthari, and it was clear to him that when the user's eyes turned a clouded white, and they saw things that only they could see, the truth of Shaldokos drew near. Use of the Solthari became essential to the practice of the Theashar, and its preparation was left to the slaves of Altheon, who worked the fields in defeat. Born of Ulthandros, and full of anguish for the treachery of Baltaros, the pride of the renowned champion Arion was in ruin. But he was a man who bore in his chest the fires of old, and no matter the hardship, he refused to relinquish hope. Amongst the leaves of the Solthari he gathered allies, and as his hands worked, sheaf and scythe in constant sway, his mind plotted. Arion surmised that many of the Shalashar had left the city, and so, at first, he thought he might begin the craft of arms for an assault. But in time, others came forth, and together they prepared to avenge Orthandros by subtler means. Despite growing use, the Theashar remained unlearned in the lore of the Solthari. Desirous of its power, they became lax and heedless of its preparation. The slaves reasoned this, and the most adept among them began to tamper with the plant, substituting deadlier herbs and introducing latent poisons in hopes of purging the upper city. By the skill of few, the masters of Altheion became frail, and many died. Morissa no longer took of the herb, and her father was spared such a fate. But Xanados, the Lord's son, grew deathly ill. The ploy of the slaves was fruitful, but Arion knew not that Baltaros abstained from the Solthari, and when he saw the betrayer ride in fury with the Black House, he laid down his scythe, and his heart was stricken. As Baltaros rode through the fields, Arion cast his gaze around him and saw that his people were afraid. When he looked into the eyes of his former allies riding in the colors of the enemy, he knew that others may surrender to the west, but he would not. He felt then his breast beat hard, his warrior's heart returning. He would protect his people by any means. When Baltaros drew near, announcing death and proclaiming the wrath of Lash Azul, Arion gripped his fallen scythe and rallied the slaves to charge. It was in this way that the slaves of Altheion died, or won their freedom, for Baltaros fell, and the land took him. Arion was sentenced to spend the remainder of his days in the Catharsia, a fate worse than death. In time, Xanados healed, and he took his father's place upon the throne of Altheion. He was feared, but he was no leader of men, for he was forgotten in childhood, and he grew strange. The trickery of Arion had also left its mark upon him, and the young lord ruled with a warring mind. Riding at the head of his legions, Daedrin pushed north through Aberathon. When the forest relented, they found themselves in a deep quarry. There, Daedrin raised his hand, and the Shalashar halted. They were come to the land of the Fortala. In the silence, Daedrin became uneasy, and he dismounted to examine the earth. In the stillness of the wind, a man appeared on a high ridge, holding in his hands a single tree branch and a black stone. He called to the Shalashar, and as they listened, fear mastered them. A colossal shape emerged through the dense fog, and the snow upon the mountains fell, crashing down upon them. Daedrin escaped the cataclysm and wandered lost in the wilderness, tormented and cursing the gods. In time, he came into a clearing, and he was encircled by ravenous wolves. The fight was long and cruel, but at last the beasts were scattered. Daedrin lay withering on the forest floor, until the remnant of his men chanced upon him. When they had found their way back to Altheon, a council was held praising Daedrin and his men for his command in the name of Lash Azul, winning southern Atharu and besting death. The general became known as the Exalted. It was Lash Azul alone that learned the full extent of the defeat, for Daedrin swore his men to secrecy. He was unsure of what he had seen, but he knew his tormentor was not of man, and seeds of doubt were cast upon Shaldokos. He revealed to none that the creature in the mountains was the cause of his nightmares. Daedrin's secret fear festered in him, and he deemed that to overcome his horror, the light of Shaldokos itself must descend upon the battlefield. When Lash Azul came into Altheon, walking upon the backs of men, Daedrin vowed to his master that he would create for him a new, magnificent vanguard. The Exalted would forge the mightiest Theashar into lords of war, and the truest and most devout Shalashar would walk the path of Shardanos. In time, there would appear at the head of legions warriors in golden armor, who bore above their misted eyes the symbol of the Theashar. It was not long after that Yaran was recognized as a Shalashar, having bested many foes under the tutelage of Avarius, one whom Daedrin counted as a brother. But Yaran's training did not cease when he received his white cloak, for Daedrin had great designs for his son, and he began to study under Shardanos, in hopes that he'd grow to be the most feared instrument of Lasheol the world had ever known. After much deliberation, Drakar received his blessing from Ancelion. For the love of his city and his people, he would rid himself of his long guilt. Taking the name Absinus, he came by stealth into Altheon, seeking to learn that which compelled Baltaros to betray his people. Hoping to elevate himself from the lower city, he began to study in the ways of the Theashar. It was then, when Drakar had the trust of Altheon, and had walked as Absinus among the people of the Will for some time, that he first beheld Marissa. Seldom did she appear, and always her face was hidden, but in time he learned that she was the daughter of Shardanos, and he was drawn to her. Since leaving Altazan, Marissa struggled with her faith in the Will. She worried for Shardanos, and became unresponsive to that which had taken him from her. In time, her doubts grew, and she feared that her son would become as her father, weak, blind to the world, and consumed by thoughts of invisible things. As she changed, so did her bond with Daedran. He had grown distrustful of her, judging her to be disloyal, and they would often fight. Their marriage became strained, and in the years after Daedran's return from the north, when Yaran was compelled from his own path, Marissa found that her love for her husband grew weaker by the day. In the Will were many sacred places, not least of which were the Lashakai. These watchtowers were built as great monuments to the wisdom of Lashaol, touching the sky in tribute to Shaldokos. When Altheon's place in Ulthalor was assured, there was built a new tower, which rose on an island in the bay east of the city. Shardanos would often ascend the tower, looking north to the mountains and east across the water. But there came a time when the High Theashar locked himself away, and the gaze of the Eye of Altheon was fixed unblinking upon Theandul. Until at last, in his piety, Shardanos faded. When Shardanos died, giving himself fully to Lashaol, and indulging without restraint the ways of the Theashar, Marissa plunged into misery. Her sadness turned to sorrow, and her distrust to hatred. When she felt the darkness begin to consume her, she sought the night, and left Altheon for the water by her father's tower. There, she contemplated ending her life. It was Absinus that glimpsed her in the dark, and approached her upon the brink, risking all, for he thought that like him she also wore a mask. They spoke there in the night, and by morning had returned to Altheon. In time their bond grew, and Absinus revealed his true home and rightful name. Marissa learned of the city of Theandul and its flame, and she felt renewed. Slowly she would begin to reach out to Yaran and reveal the origin of her hope. It was then that Yaran's devotion to Daedran and his cause began to waver, for in his father's surety that Yaran would ascend to heights unmatched, a coldness fell upon them, and their speech together grew distant. Yaran hearkened to his mother, for his love for her was ever greater than for his father, and he began to feel as she felt when she suffered the decay of Shardanos. In time, Yaran came to know Drakar, and their meetings were strange, for they were held in secrecy, lest their disloyalty be laid bare. It was in the shadows of Altheon that such disparate people forged their union. Then came Eperos and his band of Theashar. From Ithurian they came, crossing the expanse of Lashazul's dominion, and rode into Altheon, seeking to bring the light of the West to those at the door of the enemy. For Osiris and the lonely city, Vrakar came to Eberros and declared his desire to see such wonders. As he passed the white gates and beheld leagues uncounted held by the enemy, a darkness fell upon him, and he wondered if he might succumb to the grandeur of the West and forsake everything he once held dear. Vrakar left Altheon in sorrow, promising that he would return to Marissa as soon as he was able. Shortly after Vrakar's departure, Daedrin discovered a book amongst Yaran's possessions that Vrakar had gifted to Marissa. Long had the Exalted perceived the change in his wife and son, and now, with all secrets unveiled, he took Marissa and branded her in the name of Lasheol. Yaran forced his way to Daedrin and struggled to free her, but he was overwhelmed and forced to submit.
Let me pass! Father! Stop this!
Seeking freedom from his father, Yaran fled Altheon in the night and swore upon the winds that he would return with aid and free his mother.
Do not suffer the name Shardalini while I am gone. To me, you are Arcanis the Wise, she who stands alone, the Dark Lady of Altheon.
Yaran would forge his own path, and with the brothers he would meet along the way, he would release Uthalor from the serpents of the heart. He would give his life for the land itself. But those are tales for another time.
Prisoners of the minds, what they strive for. Loose an illusion of free will, keep us